end this successful term that we've had. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. David Halpern from the Government Behavioural Insight team. And the team, also known as the Nudge Unit, provides the research conducted by academics on the field of psychology and behavioural economics. And so it's particularly relevant today because, of course, of the impact of behavioural economics on policy decisions. So, for example, will consumers react to a change in the tax rate? And so this area is particularly important today as we try to use policy to deal with our fiscal stance and our low growth. And so policymakers need to evaluate how individuals and firms will react to any changes in policy. And so just a bit of background to our speaker today. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Government. He previously worked as Chief Analyst in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit from 2001 to 2007. And he's also been part of the Cambridge Life when he held tenure at the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences. He has also held posts at Nuffield College, Oxford, and the Policy Studies Institute in London. And so no doubt this will be a fascinating event, but it is very current to today as well. And so I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Halpern today to give us an insight into this incredibly interesting area. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Halpern.
Hi guys, great to be here. Hope I didn't keep you waiting too long. Yeah, I mean actually, I've spent a lot of my life working with economists, but I'm not really an economist. I actually used to teach psychology when I was here at Cambridge. But it is definitely a really interesting area. I hope I can at least kind of communicate some of the sort of the energy and enthusiasm and the practicality of this sort of work. So what I thought I would rattle through today is just some quite concrete examples. If you don't like graphs, simple one, you're not going to like this. But these are actual numbers as opposed to just made up numbers. And so I go through some kind of simple applications of this sort of work as we were doing in government. And then we'll go through some slightly more advanced sort of applications about how regulation and how it might imply different ways of thinking about utility in particular, or well-being, and sort of try and draw it together. I was thinking of trying to talk for like half an hour or something like that, and then we'll have time for conversation. Is that good? No? Great, fantastic. All right, see if this works. Okay, well, of course, nudging in some ways has been done for a long time, as to say, using instruments apart from economic instruments to change behaviour. I don't know if anyone knows what this is, but it's a picture of somewhere called Manny Corner in outside Birmingham. I don't know, anyone who know why it's famous? Anyone know why it's famous, this place? It's obviously not that famous in here anyway. Well, I'll just say in the kind of early 1920s, these newfangled motor cars were shooting around this corner and they kept hitting each other, right? So lots of accidents. So somebody had a bright idea, you know, you could have had bigger fines or sanctions or whatever. Why don't we paint a line down the road, right? So interesting idea at the time. Of course, it turned out to be a really effective way of shaping behaviour. So, you know, you might want to be on one side of the road or the other. And hey presto, was the first line in the UK, subsequently spread across the rest of the UK. It's a very nice, actually, everyday example of a nudge, and the Highway Code is full of them. In fact, even the fact that the Highway Code was literally that for most of its history is itself intriguing. So it wasn't a set of laws, it was just literally a code. When you learned to drive, when I learned to drive, it was certainly still a Highway Code. It was just sort of, you know, you don't have to do this, but good idea, you might want to drive on this side of the road, and that's what everybody else does, and so on. But it didn't actually have particular fines or sanctions. It wasn't embodied in law until quite recently. So there are lots of these sorts of examples where, in particular, just using, you know, passing a law or using a straightforward fine or financial sanction might not be the best way of affecting behaviour. Lots of other ones. Another relatively famous classic one is how people got into the habit of eating potatoes. You know, it's one where Europeans were being encouraged to eat potatoes in order deliberately to a couple of particularly monarchs thought it would be a good idea because to diversify the crop, right? So if you only ever eat, you know, wheat and the crop fails, this is a problem. So people thought, well, as the potato was kind of discovered, wouldn't it be good if our peasants ate potatoes as well? But the thing is, potato's not a very appealing looking vegetable. If you hadn't seen it before, it looks like a kind of turd or whatever, and peasants weren't really taking to it. And they tried various kind of essentially inducements to do that. But the one that really is generally credited, almost folklore really of doing it, is that this particular monarch basically said, okay, what we'll do is we're going to change tack. We're going to proclaim that the potato is a royal vegetable and should only be eaten by members of the royal family and the household. And then he planted a load of these in front of the palace, and then he appointed a couple of his worst guards to do a not very good job of looking after these things. Well, hey presto, of course, people rapidly started stealing them and selling them on the black market, and it became, really popular really fast. So instead of using a kind of conventional, again, sanction or inducement, actually it's just doing something a bit more subtle. All right, so that kind of by very general background. Of course, more recently it's become a bit more fashionable. I mean, Danny Kahneman's work particularly has sort of brought it to a wider audience. And when I was your age, actually, and at Cambridge as an undergraduate in NatSci, I can remember actually Danny Kahneman's work was already sort of sat in the remainders section of bookshops from his work in the 70s. Obviously, for those who don't know it, I don't know how many have read this, Danny Kahneman's? Very good. All right, we're in business now. We're going on potatoes, a highway code. But anyway, for those who don't know, obviously it's basically around the sort of two-system model of thinking and cognition. That a lot of decisions are made very rapidly. So when you go on your commute to work, if you do such a thing, you don't really think about it. You just kind of go on autopilot, even though you're making decisions. And if you have to go somewhere different, or if, for example, for me, instead of going home like usual today, I have to remember actively I'm supposed to come to King's, right? And it's effortful. As opposed to a lot of those kind of decisions that are effortful, where you really think about, they're actually very much the minority of how decisions are made. This is important, particularly in policy making, right? Because actually, places like Whitehall and Westminster are full, for the most part, of people who are kind of rational, and they think that that's how decisions are made, right? So you'll design laws, and the Treasury will work out tax incentive systems, and that will rationally affect people's behaviour. Turns out it often doesn't work very well. Of course, Nudge is one of those kind of classic crossover books, which I'm sure you've all read. But I think one of the reasons why it had a particular impact is it is a crossover. Sometimes it requires someone from another discipline. So Dick Thaler is, of course, economist from Chicago, and Cass Sunstein is a lawyer, right? They're not psychologists, but they were writing for this wider audience. And they're essentially taking these findings largely from the lab. I mean, Danny's fantastic, but he's never been very interested in policy applications, and saying, well, what might you do about it? There are also books, actually just before the 2010 election, something I was involved in with colleagues at the Institute for Government, is ways of trying to codify it and say, well, actually, what would this mean in practical terms for policy makers? So Mindspace is a mnemonic, actually. It's basically a way of just saying, here's the things that really drive behaviour and affect change. So messenger effects, for example, won't go through the whole lot, but it matters who tells you something, not just what the information is. It matters. If you want to persuade your kids to get vaccinated, don't get your Secretary of State for Health to tell everybody to get vaccinated. Get your chief medical officer to suggest it to people, right? It makes a big difference. Incentive effects, norms, defaults, I won't go through the list. All right, but one of the key things that happened in 2010, I'm actually to give you a tiny backstop. Actually, you mentioned I worked for Tony Blair for 6 years. And back then, actually more than a decade ago, we did a paper on behaviour change. And it all went horribly wrong, actually. In the sense that, actually I realise you have cameras on, I should be a bit careful what I was saying. The paper was leaked in for day 4. I remember coming into the office that day, and it was already on the front page of the Times. And the reason it was there, we'd written this document. It was quite dry, 70 pages, and on every page it said, this is not a statement of government policy. It was a discussion document about policy implications, for behavioural economics in particular. But we made a one-line reference by how actually price signals, affect, relevant to changing behaviour. They affect certain things very effectively in certain circumstances. So, for example, driving substitution from one product to another. So, leaded versus unleaded fuel. That substitution occurred really fast with quite a small price differential. So maybe you could do such things around food. Anyway, this turned up on the front page of the Times with a whacking great pork pie saying, Prime Minister's Strategy Unit proposes fat tax, which kind of went on from there, and it was like, the tabloids got hold of it, and then they of course, with that fantastic inventiveness of the British tabloids, they got the cabinet, and they'd estimated weights for different members of the cabinet to work out how much fat tax would they each pay. In particular, of course, for Prescott, how much fat tax will Preza pay? He was quite large. Anyway, for various reasons, you can see why it all blew up, and it does illustrate that these approaches are quite difficult for government. But sort of fast forward to 2010, and you've got the, there we are, the coalition government, and they were really interested in this approach, actually. So I left government, I thought I'd done my time, but, and in the coalition agreement there's this phrase, our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support and enable people to make better choices for themselves. I mean, other contributory factors you might say is you've got no money anyway, right? So Whitehall and the Treasury doesn't have the money that you'd used before. And actually you've got an administration which by instinct doesn't really like to legislate, right? It'd rather not tell people what to do by passing new laws. So that created quite a good space within which you say, well, what else could you do? And you're not going to just throw money at things or pass laws. What else could you do? And Steve Hilton, who was at that time the PM's political advisor, had spent a while in the US, and he met Richard Thaler and a number of other people and said, well, look, isn't this really neat? Couldn't we do something with this? So we set up this unit, they, generally known as the Nudge Unit, and we set up a skunk work operation. So we a small team answering directly really to the PM, the Deputy Prime Minister, actually with a steering group chaired by the Cabinet Secretary, for those interested in how Whitehall works. But basically it was a skunk work, in the sense we have given a lot of freedom to try some stuff out and see if anything would work. And not being constrained by some of the normal rules of Whitehall. We have an academic advisory board panel, and actually the former Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, got so into it, he chairs that as well. So that's by way of background. Okay, fine, so let's get into, well, did any of it work? Fortunately, it did. So I'm going to just show you some examples, go through them pretty rapidly, and I'll show you some of the results. So this is not high theory, but the basic idea is pretty simple. If you're building a model, I mean, either a political economy or indeed what you think people do in an economy or wherever else, and instead of building it on a sort of the models that you might have in your undergraduate textbooks, but you built it on a realistic account of how actually people make decisions and make behaviour, you might get better policy, right? So I'll try and show you some examples that illustrate this point. Sometimes pretty powerful, interesting results. So this one is actually the kind of classic one. Actually, it predates the administration. Even in Tony's time, we were working on it, which is changing defaults. So this is a sort of classic one, right? And the basic idea is really simple, and it's based on this issue of procrastination. So lots of intend to do things, but because of hyperbolic discounting and so on, we never get around to doing it. So we never get around to exercising. Well, maybe you guys do, but most people don't, because you think, oh, if I'll look beautiful and I'll live forever, but in the short term, sorry, in the long term, but in the short term, I'll get sweaty and it'll be effortful, so I won't do it. But when you think about tomorrow, of course, you think, well, actually, you then discount the effort and the sweat, and that's fine. So actually, then it balances out and you think, I will do it. And people sincerely believe they will exercise tomorrow, right? In their sort of utility function kind of thing. And that's clearly true for things like pension savings. So a lot of people think we want to save more, but they don't. Even when money is available, it's a big subsidy, you just got to tick the box and the employer will put in a load of money into your pension. They still didn't do it. So the basic idea was just change the default. So you don't have to do it, you can opt out, but actually if the default is you're in the pension scheme unless you choose to opt out. What difference is made in the UK? Here's the UK data. There's before enrolment, and this is done for about 50 big firms after auto enrolment. In fact, for those who are eligible, it's 91%. So those figures are being suppressed just because there are some people who actually aren't eligible at a given time, like they're still on the payroll, but actually like they're off sick or whatever it would be. Now, I don't know if it seems a big deal to you. To policymakers, this is amazing. People have been trying to sort this out for 50 years to drive up the saving rate, right? And the standard tool, of course, is to use some kind of tax subsidy in order to crack it, right? We actually now have some estimates about how effective is a tax subsidy at increasing a saving rate for pension, particularly actually using Danish data as it happens for various reasons. And essentially, for every extra pound of tax subsidy that you use, you get about 6p of extra saving overall, right? It's phenomenally ineffective. And what it mainly does is it gets about 15% of the population to move their investments from one form to another, generally to a more tax-efficient form. That's what the subsidy primarily does. Now, you might say of this one, well, but maybe that, if people are saving more for their pension because of default, maybe they're saving less elsewhere. Actually, that's not true. For the amount of extra saving going in, it's about 80p, as it were, of extra saving for every pound going in. So there's a very slight reduction in saving elsewhere. So it's just a stomping, enormous effect. It's a game changer for something which, either through trying to encourage extra private provision and saving, or doing it through state pension, where you've got the issue of people don't want to pay the taxes either, you can't get the saving rate up. Those the famous original study showed that within 2 to 3 years you get the saving rate up from about 3-4% to 11% within a couple of years. So there we go. That's a good simple example, but it's a very big, powerful one, and it's rolling out at the moment. All right, here's another one, getting some which may be less familiar to you. So in the early days, one of the things we had to do, right, is to show, not least the armies of economists in Whitehall, that we might be able to add some value. So here's a good simple issue, and it's getting people to pay their tax, right? So these are actual letters, and this is just a little experiment on 600 million of unpaid self-assessment tax. If you're HMRC, of course, the numbers you deal with are very large. So this is people who've you have to do a self-assessment. Probably wouldn't, unless you would never come across such a thing, but you'll look forward to that, I'm sure, in future years. And then you fill out this thing, and it actually turns out you owe some tax. So there's 2 letters here. For those who are really astute, you can see there's 1 line difference between. So actually, this isn't a bad letter for government. This is a pretty good letter. It's quite simple. But there's 1 line difference, which we add in here, which is we actually just tell people something that is true. And in this case, we're using a social norm. So one of the very powerful influences on behaviour is what other people are doing, right? Or what you think other people are doing. Everyday example of it is litter. So if you come back to your car and in the windshield there's a flyer, do you drop it on the ground or do you not? Well, if there are lots of the flyers already on the ground, you are 8 times more likely to drop it on the ground, right? You may not feel good about it, but that's what it does. So the question is, just telling people something which is true, most people pay their tax on time, would it make a difference? Well, here we go. By the way, notice the marginal cost of this, to do it on a few thousand letters, is basically 0, right? And our measure we're going to use is whether people are paid in 23 days, which is the point at which HMRC start getting a bit more aggressive. So here we go. Here's the control. Number of people paid after 23 days. Just telling people that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. There we go. If we adjust it, actually, we make it into a local norm. So we say 9 out of 10 people in Cambridge, by the way, we have to check that's true because we're virtuous, pay their tax on time. That's even more effective, right, if you do it local. We know this from other social norm effects, by the way. There's another way of expressing it. Actually, if you go back to the litter example, there is one circumstance under which you are even less likely to drop your piece of litter on the ground. I don't know if you know what it is, but it's if it's a perfectly clean environment with 1 piece of litter. You're even less likely than if it was no litter at all, as if it reminds you. Anyway, so one of the things we know from this literature is you want to pose the exception as, the person who's not doing it as the exception. So we just flip the wording around and we instead say, you are one of the very few people who have yet to pay your tax, right? So it's the other way around, it's the same information. Even better, nice thing about that is you don't really have to calculate it for the local area as well. If you combine the 2, most people in Cambridge pay their tax on time, and you're one of the few who hasn't. There you go. We've done loads of these sorts of trials now, and last year we brought forward about £250 million extra by just doing these kinds of adjustments in letters. The other beautiful thing about them, by the way, is it reduces complaints. They get less complaints for these letters than they used to have for the ones that preceded them. Turns out it's quite nice to be told that your fellow citizens are more virtuous than you thought they were, rather than being just threatened. All right, so there's lots more. Of course, it gets into segmentation, and you can work out which messages work better for which people. But of course, the marginal, returns are enormous given the low cost of the intervention. All right, here's another one. So here's a kind of typical situation in Whitehall. So the department turns up, in this case, DEC, and they say, can you give us another £1 billion for loft insulation? Because there's still about 1/3 of people in Britain who've got under-insulated lofts, right? Anybody got a loft that probably at home your parents is not insulated or not properly insulated? It's supposed to be like this thick now. Come on, somebody. Sure. Anyway, it's very surprising. We've got rational, utility maximizing parents. Okay, well, anyway, when we looked at it, conclusion, one of the reasons why it wasn't that you needed to increase the subsidies, because it's already really heavily subsidized, right? Loft insulation. It's very cheap. So what was wrong with these last third of people? And one of our conclusions was it's friction costs. We're obsessed with friction costs, right? So what that means in this case is their lofts are full of crap, basically. So your parents might have all your old English and school textbooks or whatever, right? And your toys, and they should have thrown them out years ago, but they never got around to it. So we then run a trial. This is just using a leaflet study. It's a small sample, but so we're just seeing what the response rate is. So we just zeroed this to 1. That's just a leaflet telling people, you know, subsidized installations available, call this number, etc., etc. One thing was, well, let's try a discount. Let's try a bigger discount. We did give it a little twist, which is we thought we'd try and make it real, and it's an efficiency game. If you got together with your neighbours, right, the van can come along and we can do it really cheaply. So if you get together with your neighbour or two, we'll give you like a 40% discount on top of the existing discount. It does bugger all, really. Now, of course, that might be because we're English and we don't really like talking to our neighbours. But otherwise, so the other one we thought, well, if the issue is that people's lofts are full of crap, what happens if we offer them a service, which, by the way, they have to pay for and it costs several hundred quid. So it's a lot more than the insulation itself. But someone will come to your house and they'll take all the crap out of the loft. And actually what they do is they offer to put it in 3 piles, you know, chuck this away, give this to charity, I want to keep that, can you put it back in afterwards? Oh, and they'll insulate your loft. Right, so it's cost the people a lot more. Anyway, you see roughly 5-fold uptake. So the issue wasn't really more money, right? It's another kind of friction cost. It's all trivial in some way, right? But it's like, oh yeah, but why didn't we do that already then? Every click matters. So I said we get obsessed about friction costs. And we're often kind of neglectful of them. Something called channel effects in the literature or whatever. But it really matters. Here's another HMRC one, the simple one. Getting a letter telling you you've got to go and fill in this form and pay your tax. The letter basically gives you the web page you're supposed to go to. That's how many people go and fill it in. This is basically exactly the same, except it just saves you 1 click, right? So instead of going to the web page, where there's the form and you click on the form, it just gives you a couple of extra characters and it takes you straight to the form. There you go. Now again, HMRC, a few percent is worth often hundreds of millions, right? So these are a very big deal. Every little friction matters. We're in a little playful one. Just thought, even the bloody envelope matters that it comes in, right? So if you get a letter from government, it's in a brown envelope and you sort of can recognize that it's the case, and you tend not to put it to the top of the pile in many people's households. So we just thought, well, why don't you just try changing the envelope? In this case, we sent a white envelope instead of a brown envelope, and then actually someone we got to write on it saying, David, you really should open this, right? It's kind of a standard thing. Anyway, we did 5,000 of those. So if you ever come to be an intern in HMRC, it's the kind of thing you might get to see. Did it make a difference? Yeah, of course it makes a difference. The return on this, by the way, even someone's being paid, actually wasn't an intern to write 5,000 times, was more than 200 to 1 in terms of the additional revenue that it brings in. Obviously, we're just kind of making a point with it, really. Here's another one, legacy giving. So the government and the PM was quite interested in trying to encourage people to give more money to charity when they die. And in fact, there was this campaign run by Telegraph called Legacy 10. And the idea was to encourage people to give 10% of their estate, sorry, excuse me, to charity. Okay, so you can see the wheels of Treasury turning, as probably yours are, thinking, how much would you have to do on your tax subsidy to encourage people to give 10%, right, of their estate away? So we didn't have billions to do. We thought, okay, why don't we just try something else? Why don't we just try asking people nicely? So in this case, what we did a trial with actually just a big group of lawyers who write wills for the middle class, and we said, can you just ask in your script, add to your script the question, would you give some money? Would you like to give some money? There you go. That's the control group. How many, proportion of people who are giving to charity in their wills. When you just add in the question into the script, you basically get a doubling. If you ask a better worded question, which is something like, are there any causes or charities you're passionate about, right? And you'd like to give some money to? There you go. And the size of the bequests double. So it's a 6-fold increase by just asking the question at the right time, right? It's a lot cheaper than some massive tax subsidy. It raises a secondary question as well. Government doesn't write wills, but we'll come on to that if we have time. And I think it's probably the last one I was going to give on this series, which is getting people into employment. So this one, we do a lot of work on growth, actually, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that in questions, but we thought this one was going to be really tough, right? So how could you go into a job centre, and what you're going to try and do is you're not going to change people's skill level, right? You're not going to change the structure in the labour market, but could you make changes that will get more people into work faster, right? And we'll leave aside a lump of labour fallacy stuff. But so what we do, we basically made three changes. Anybody ever been to a job centre? Actually, signed on? Yeah. What was your experience? Go on, share with us. Do you remember when you first went in? What do you have to do? Were you nodding, or were you just slightly falling asleep? Oh, sorry, I thought you were saying yes. I was like, oh, very good. All right, okay, none of you have been to or admitting to being a job centre. If you do go in one day, you'll find the first thing that happens is you get a whole load of forms you're given and you're asked to fill in, right? So a whole load of paper. So what it's doing is setting the tone behaviourally to, well, you fill in forms in this place, as opposed to what we really want you to do is think about getting some work. So we reduced the number of forms. In fact, there were 8 to 9 different forms that people had to sign when they go in. So we managed to get it down to 2. In fact, one of the forms was an extra form to sign so they would have your signature, which I think is quite funny. Anyway, so we do that. We also do, there's a lot of interest around what's called implementation intentions. So people intend to do stuff, but they don't get around to doing it. A good example, you can practice at home if you want, is the alarm. Actually, you've got alarm clocks. Do students have alarm clocks these days? Anyway, your phone. The alarm goes off and you're like, oh, I can't be bothered to get up. Actually, a good way of doing it is saying, I won't get up now, I'll get up in 10 seconds, right? And then you think about it in 10 seconds, then you get up. It's actually much, much easier, right? Because you plan for it, you create this intention, and then you action it. Anyway, the whole benefit system, for a long time, has been built in Britain around the claimant commitment it's called. So someone comes in, and the whole system is designed to make sure you're not cheating, and particularly, you have to prove that you've looked for at least 3 jobs in the last couple of weeks, right? Perfectly sensible, you might think. Behaviourally, there's a big problem with that, right? In some ways, who gives a shit what you did in the last couple of weeks? The question is what you're going to do in the next couple of weeks. So we turn it around, and we said, get the advisors to say, ask people what they're going to do in the next 2 weeks. Not only that, you get them to plan, a bit like waking up in the morning. So to be as specific as possible, think about when are you going to do this? So when are you going to go on search? And you probe when, how, where, etc. So you're like, okay, right, well, after I take the kids to school in the morning, so on Wednesday, that would be good. So Wednesday morning after kids to school, I'll look on monster.com for retail jobs in Essex. And they write it down themselves, right? It combines a number of things. So those are the kind of changes we're making. So the question is, does it make any difference? Number of get into work. And the measure in this case is the number of coming off benefits at 13 weeks. That's just how the system is used. It's built, so we use that. So it's going along before, and here comes our intervention. So what we're doing is we're randomizing across 2 floors of a job centre, by the way. That's what it is. Blah, blah, blah. Bit of seasonal fluctuation. So this is an enormous effect for DWP, job centre. That just changing the way that we frame and direct people can have such a big impact. It turns out, we see as a Kahneman again, it's not actually just small things that are affected by these small channel effects and frictions and so on, but really big decisions are too. So, for example, a nice study in students, actually in Bettinger, to give you another one in the US, where pre-filling application forms to go to university, right? It costs a few dollars. The intervention in the US system, it uses tax information to pre-fill the form. So someone's coming for the reason, you say, would you like us to do your application form? Leads to a 25% increase in the number of disadvantaged kids who go to university and a 1/3 increase in the number who get scholarships, right? Really cheap compared to a scholarship, just filling in the bloody form. You might think it's a major thing in life. It's these things are incredibly. The suicide rate in the UK, drops dramatically about 30, 40 years ago. Do you know why? Anybody know? You might. No? I think you're looking at the generational effect there. No guesses? What happens at that time? It's no, but you're right, it's right. It's when natural gas comes on stream in the UK. Why does this make such a big difference, suicide rates? Do you know what it's been? Because people used to kill themselves by putting their head in the oven. And why did that work? It's because before we had natural gas, you derived gas from other sources and it had carbon monoxide in it. That's why putting your head in the oven could kill yourself with it, right? Because of carbon monoxide. Hey presto, natural gas got no carbon monoxide. you see about a 30% reduction in suicide rate, which never goes back up again, right? So it's not just small things that are affected by this little extra effort. You think if you're going to kill yourself, it's quite a serious decision. Turns out, no, head in the oven, half an hour, nothing happening. Oh, whatever, I'll go home. Right? Okay, so those are kind of everyday. You can summarize some of these things. I won't go into detail, but if you want to blag it, it's just 4 very simple variables. Something it's really not complicated. If you want someone to do something, make it easy, right? Take away all the frictional costs, etc. You make it attractive, which can include personalization, just literally attractive in the sense of catching attention, as well as the kind of more conventional sense. Social, what are other people doing? Use social norms. And timely. So many interventions, when you're working out your neat little models for your studies or whatever, on some kind of intervention, you often forget the timeliness. Like there are certain things which generally will be incredibly ineffective, but at certain moments will be extraordinarily effective. So if you want to get people to cycle to work or take public transport or something, right? You can try and subsidise with this, or actually literally go out and with coaches and knock on people's door and say, hey, these are alternative ways to get to work. It's all kind of generally a waste of time. There's one exception, if they've just moved house. If someone's just moved house in the last 3 months, you talk to them, it's very effective. You can drive substitution, right? Because their behaviour has been disrupted and the new habits haven't formed. Okay, I just very quickly, I thought I'd give you some, since you're very smart, some other examples. Is that all right? Or you want to go straight to some questions? Right? A bit more at once? Okay, that was all very basic. So you can use the kind of behavioural insights and behavioural economics and learn how to do these particular interventions, which is neat and fun and powerful. Or actually you can use it in a more fundamental way around regulation and so on, about how you think about markets and what it means. So, it's a simple kind of processes like cool, all kinds of things, how people answer the phone or whatever. But actually a lot of it is stuff on a whole other level, right? So an example would be the energy market. It's a good topical example, actually. So 6 major suppliers. How many tariffs do you think there are? Energy tariff, electricity tariffs, for example, in the UK. 6 major tariffs. Companies, blah, 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 any ideas? We don't know. You're on the right track. It is certainly more than 500. By some estimates, about 2,000. It's literally loads of them. But yeah, if you say something like mobile phone, on the other hand, right? How many phone network tariff combinations are there? When you go in, you might choose between. Actually, no one really knows. Estimates range between about 7 million and 12 million for the UK. You're kind of beyond people's cognitive capacity. So the question is, what do you do? What does that mean for a regulator? If you go back to energy, one option, of course, you could just say, well, freeze prices. I don't know what you think about that policy, but I won't even ask you. But, you can try and reduce and regulate the number of tariffs. Or you can say, could we just take out the friction to make it possible? So, for example, well, actually, I'll show you an example of that in a minute. On regulation or feedback, on public health. So, I don't know what would be a good example. Government buys a lot of stuff, right? Buy loads and loads of things, but we never give feedback on how good it is. Or in a care home, right? So, how can it be you can go to Japan and choose from here in Cambridge your hotel, but you can't choose or get feedback on a care home for your mum down the road, right? Like these kind of, what are the nature of the market failure? And if you're building it on, so a lot of market failures classically in policy were arrested on certain work, it's pretty classical assumptions. I suppose a consumer detriment is to do with these kind of behavioural effects, right? Like they're not a small issue, they are absolutely dominant. A lot of markets don't work because of these behavioural issues. And of course the other thing, if you really want to be advanced, is it starts to raise questions about what are you trying to do? What's your notion of utility? Actually, at the bottom of Nudge, although Richard Thaler's never been very into it personally, it makes reference to happiness, right? What would it mean to increase your happiness? Because if it's right, we make misjudgments. It might also be to do with our well-being too. So here are quick examples. Here's one on going back to your phone. So an alternative approach, which actually we are going to make happen, is when you get your phone bill, imagine if on the, electricity bill, or it could be either, there's a QR code with your information. So you just take out the friction costs. So loads of people, when they go to switch, if they finally think it'd be a good idea and they'd save hundreds of pounds, and why is it so few switch if they'd save so much money? One reason, like, even if you go to a switching site, it starts asking you questions like you don't know. People don't know what tariff they're on. They don't even know what their company is. But actually you can put it all in a QR code. So then all you need to do, put your phone against it and hey presto, it tells you in about 1 second, hey, are you David Halpern? Yes. this is the best tariff for you, click here, right? This, you can see, is a game changer for the operation of a market, right? Built basically on understanding why these frictional effects are so big. So we will bring in QR codes. Another different kind of class, I'll just give one example of it, but is actually something I used to write a lot on and do work on, which is outside the real economy, so-called. Sometimes some people call it the economy of regard. Have you heard this phrase? I have an offer, an economic historian from Oxford used it quite a bit. But there's a kind of gift, it's basically like a gift economy, right? So if you do something like a time budget study and you work out, well, how do people spend their lives, right? It turns out that a lot of our lives are not spent in the real economy, certainly not in paid work. So, for example, for all adults in the UK, 18 to death, right? It's less than a quarter of waking time is spent in paid work, right? Because you've got weekends and holidays and retirement and pissing around and shopping and the economic. But a lot of activity is essentially care-based exchanges, right? You're looking after your kids, or whatever, or blah, blah, blah. Or cooking dinner for your friends, something, right? And it is transactional, actually, but it's not transactional in a normal main economy way. And if you do an odd thing, if you say, imagine you monetize that at simply minimum wage rate, and say, how big a number is that? For the UK, that's more than GDP per capita, if you just quantify some of that stuff. Anyway, so it goes to a very powerful idea. People like to help each other. Here's just one quick illustration of it. This is something actually from, I'll explain myself first of all. You know, if you go to a hospital in the UK, right, and you want to stay with your child or your partner, you'll probably be told, yeah, right, the visiting hours are the following, right? So you turn your back on this capacity for people to help each other. Or if you're really persuasive, they might say, well, there's that manky armchair, you're just sleeping in the corner. Here's an alternative one. It comes from Sweden. It's the Lund Patient Hotel, and you'll get the point straight away. Here's a picture of one of the rooms. And hey presto, there's 2 beds. No shit. And so you're going to stay, well, yeah, you're expected actually to stay with your partner or your child, right? Would people really like it? And you get better clinical outcomes, and you have higher patient satisfaction, and it's got lower unit cost, right? So designing public services that utilise this capacity, people a desire to help each other, actually. What's the examples of that? We're codifying a lot of this stuff, actually, by the boring but important part of this behavioural work is actually not the behavioural bit at all. It's just using intervention studies and randomised controlled trials all the time and stuff. And we're doing this through these so-called, expanding through these what works centres. So NICE is the one everybody knows about clinical medicine, but the same is true for education, right? How should schools spend its pupil premium? You know, or how should if you're a police and crime commissioner, should you buy a helicopter, right? Or should you just give kids Xboxes? Well, what would be more effective, cost-effective, right? And generally, we haven't known the answer. We just don't know, right? Because most economists have got no interest in such real-world questions, but actually they are quite important. So we're trying to build stuff on that. But the last thing I was going to get on to is well-being. I mentioned it just in passing, so one slide at least on this. So actually, Cameron has been interested in this agenda. So this graph, have you seen this graph? Have you seen this one before? GDP per capita against life satisfaction. Fortunately, there's a relationship. It's kind of good to know. It's quite a decent correlation, you see. Curvy linear, well known. The size of the bubble increases the size of the population of the country. But what's quite interesting, there's the UK. One way of reading this is to say countries seem to differ by quite large margins in how effectively they translate growth into life satisfaction. And these patterns don't seem to be random. People worry a lot about the measurement side. It actually turns out it's fine. You take someone like Switzerland, 3 different languages. What matters, the language you speak or the country you're in? It's absolutely the country you're in. The German speakers in Switzerland are really happy. German speakers just across the border are really quite miserable. Right? Not that. But still, look, so fine, the UK's doing all right. We're a bit above that trend line. But what about, we're better than Hong Kong or somewhere, right? Or Singapore, that's so rich, but they seem very happy. But look at Canada or Denmark. The Danes in the Eurobronze age have been getting happier for 30 years. I think Danes, yeah? Why would you So anyway, so the reason why this is relevant to the behavioural literature is that it looks like, as I said on the suicide point, major decisions too are subject by these same distortions. This is a really interesting policy problem. So we misremember what made us happy, basically. We come back from holiday, and people say, do you have a really good time? You go, oh, yeah. But if you kept a diary, it's like, oh my God, it's raining, my brother's really annoying me, whatever it is, blah, blah. So you misremember, and you also mispredict what will make you happy. Lots of really interesting stuff on that, right? So an example would be, nice simple one, I don't know, this one, you buy a picture, it's $150. There's two conditions though. One condition, when you buy it, the decision is final, you can't take it back. The other condition is you buy it, same $150 somewhere else, but you've got 2 weeks and you can return it, right? This is not a difficult question for an economist, which is the superior choice, right? It's the one with the additional option, same amount of money. Which one are people more satisfied in? The one where they have no option to return it, right? Okay, so raise some really deep, interesting questions. So, conclusion. We use this stuff on lots of things. Actually, I haven't even talked about growth very much. We use it in growth, employment, blah, blah, blah. But it's not really a policy area where you can't use basically behavioural economics, it turns out. When you've got bureaucracy and you've got people, it turns out it's really useful. And it's often a lot more useful than what you're going to learn in a standard economics textbook, it turns out. Here's the last one. This is to see if you really learn anything today. So I'm going to show you the results of a trial, which actually haven't published yet. There's 1 million people in the UK take part in this, and it's for organ donation. So I'm going to show you, it's an 8-arm trial. I'm going to show you the 8 conditions to see if you're still awake and all of you learn. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, which do you think is going to be most effective? Right? Here we go. So, if you've done your tax list, which Carl's going to do, if you've done your tax list recently, you might have seen, you get to the end of it, and then there's this page that comes up and says, thank you, and please join the NHS organ register. Okay? So there's condition 1, right? It's just a control group. It's just ask you. Right? I'm going to 8 of these one guys to think about, because afterwards everybody says, oh, you're that organ, right? When you think about the 4, which do you think will be the most effective of these to persuade people? This one is the same, but it's got a message in there, right? Every day, thousands of people who see this page decide to register. Social norms, right? You know social norms, right? So it's just the extra message there. That should help a bit. This is the same message, but now it's a picture of smiley people queuing up to give their kidneys. Okay, is that mine? There you go. Here's another one. It's the same message, but it's the logo, right? So there's your first 4, right? I'm going to show you the next 4. You think about which one okay. Okay, this one is it's using the lots basically. So 3 people die every day because there are not enough organ donors, right? The whole literature, lots of games, whatever we'll go to it. So actually die. Here's another one. You could save, instead of we do it in a positive way, you could save or transform up to 9 lives to the organ donor. And here's another one. Nearly there. If you need an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. Reciprocity, basically. And one more. If you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. So most people support organ donation actually in population, but they just don't get around to implementation. Okay, come on, who's going to be brave then? We're almost to the end of this. What do you think is most effective?
7.
3. There's a lot of people with 3, which is the picture. Is that right? Any other different ones? Social norms pressure. 7, okay, which was. Oh, all right. Well, one of you were really quite right. One of you were horribly wrong. One group of you, which is interesting. There's the results, and I'm going to show you. So there's control. You can see nearly all of them. It's only a few percent to join up, right? Actually, it's a big effect. So which was which? You can see most of them are a lot better than the control. And how did they really do? Come on. Actually, the best one was the reciprocity one. Actually, I think. No, I've got it. I can't read my own one. I thought it was reciprocity. Yeah. It's, would you? Looks like the numbering is wrong actually. It is the one which I think was on those slides at number 7. Would you take an organ? Right, and if so, why don't you join the register? Interestingly, the worst one, even worse than control, was the one with the picture of people. Who should apply to something? You know. Partly my making the point is that this stuff gives you a pretty good clue, but you know, when you kick in the real world, there's so many of these effects that are kicking in someone's head. You have to be experimental. You have to try this stuff out and figure out what works best. Okay, so in conclusion, behavioural insight is a very powerful tool taking root in Majesty's government and actually across the world. We have a lot of other governments now. And it's gone from being kind of a joke into actually a very serious kind of exercise, very widely used. It is also driving kind of use of randomised controlled trials in policy. I mean, for a long time, people, well, for quite a few people, have been doing development, but they funny enough haven't been doing it in domestic context, right? Well, why not? Why do a policy in one condition? Why don't you do 3 or 4 or 5 and see which works better? Right? In kind of the humility that it brings. And the other thing, actually, which I've only really skirted, but it actually raises quite interesting, deep questions about economics. And in particular, the standard stuff, when you read a paper and it says, let's assume that, and we all know that that's all crap. This is not how people are. So imagine you did try and build economics or indeed policy around realistic models of what drives behaviour. Hey presto, you get better policy and you might even get better economics. So there you go. I'm sorry I took actually much longer than I meant to, but there you go. If you want to take some questions,
thanks so much for the talk. I think that your last trial and many of the other examples you gave, it shows a kind of bucket approach to nudges. You know, let's think about what we think might work, try 10 different things, and then hope for the best. And in some cases, like your last example, even with the best expertise, it's not the nudge that experts might think will work, it's one of the others. So it just shows how all the nudges work in different contexts at different times. And I feel like if we use another 9 nudges, we might find one of those especially worked. And this kind of relates to the fact that I think that lots of the nudges that are commonly used, like social norms and otherwise, they won't carry on working. There is a, there's a set point that basically if you've got the government nudging you and Coca-Cola and whoever, then there's going to be reduced diminishing returns involved. So I wonder how close you think we are to getting to a point where within certain contexts we might know which nudges will be more effective, and then you can kind of standardize the process a bit more and maybe be more accurate about which ones you use in each trial.
Okay, so there's at least 3 questions there, I think. One is, do we know, it's like a bucket approach, do we know what works? I mean, often, like I showed you the last one because it's sort of a bit of fun really, but we are taking a punt on what we think will work, and often one of the compromises is we'll try several things at once. Like in the employment trial, actually we're trying more than one thing because we're thinking we've kind of got one shot of this. If we can't move the dial, we're not going to get asked back by this department. And what we really want to do is change policy nationally. So we do take a view. We read the literature pretty widely, and then we look at the problem and we try and figure out, well, what in this particular context do we think will work? But yes, you're right. Certainly at this point, we tend to have quite a degree of humility about, will it really, really work? Our hit rate's actually pretty good. We haven't, because the counter view is, well, some of these things should backfire, like I showed you one there. I mean, there's a guy called Ariely who did a trial on a tax, trying to get corporates to pay tax more in Israel. And he tried this message of, it's really important you pay your taxes because it pays for hospitals and schools and so on and so on. Very nice, clear result, led to less tax being paid. And even though it was a trial, they lost $90 million on it, small scale. So I think we wouldn't have made that mistake for various reasons. But you're right, it is somewhat a craft at the moment. But partly you're stuck with, the reality of if you spend your time in the psych lab as opposed to an economics faculty, your brain is full of, there are loads of different shortcuts which you're using all the time in order to figure out even the most basic things, like how far something away it is, you know. There are lots of different clues that you can use to judge distances. So if you knock out one or affect one, it doesn't mean the whole thing will go down. There's an issue about, you know, will it habituate, and can we tailor the stuff? I mean, we are getting better at tailoring. I mean, there is tailoring of a particular sense, which is also tailoring to individuals. So say on the tax work, we now increasingly we can segment too. So we can work out which messages work for different people. So it turns out, for example, if you owe a lot of tax, actually a different set of messages. I mean, some of them always work, or seem to be pretty ubiquitously effective, like you're one of the last few to pay. But there are some additional messages or approaches which work really well for people who own a lot of tax, apart from which aren't a threat necessarily. So we can start to do that in much more sophisticated ways. But you're right, it can often be atheoretically driven. It certainly is atheoretically driven in the commercial world. You think A/B formatting and so on. Now, but the other thing about habituation, which was in there, which is, will these things run out, right? So, I don't know, an example would be, we did a trial getting people to, and showed you get people to pay court fines at a much higher rate if instead of sending them letters, you send them texts on their phone, right? And it says, you know, David, you really got to pay this fine, or the bailiff's going to. But if every government starts doing that, would that work? Or the social norms thing. Actually, the social norms thing is now starting to be quite widely used. You see it in all kinds of places. I notice often thinking, like, we didn't do that one. There's like highways agencies saying, you know, 9 out of 10 drivers, whatever, blah, blah, blah. If I can't remember, for something else, I got one myself, some letter, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, it's like, will they wear out? I mean, they might do. One of the arguments against, though, is that it goes back to the Kahneman's work around the two different ways of thinking or deciding. So if a lot of your decisions are driven very rapidly, and that means that you actually don't reflect on them. So an everyday example, I mean, I was just going to say, how many of you wear watches? You don't even wear watches anymore, right? Oh, some of you still wearing watches. For those of you who wear watches, do any of you have your watch set fast? Right. Okay, but you know your watch is set fast, right? So what are you doing? How fast is your watch set?
Couple minutes.
So why'd you do that?
So I'm not late.
Right, so but have you thought about why it works? Well, I have thought about this periodically. So occasionally, I have my watch about 3 minutes fast, and occasionally I think, like, that's really dumb. I know it's 3 minutes fast. I'm not bad at math, and I can figure that. And I set it to normal time, and then I spend 2 weeks missing my train every single day, right? And the reason why I think it matters is because the moment, then, look, if you're not in a hurry, you'll make that adjustment, right? Because it's like, oh, all right. But if you're in a hurry, you don't make the full adjustment, basically. So my point I'm trying to make is that some of these effects are persistent. And the other thing that happens is that you can change the behavioural norm sometimes. So if you change the behaviour of a lot of people, then you change the kind of, as it were, the whole equilibrium starts to move. Or another way of thinking about it, sometimes you can move people's kind of behavioural riptide. So if you get people into the habit of voting, right, and other people vote, then actually they carry on, it persists. For example, voting, we specifically know that nudge is done before one election, very simple things which involve little tweaks about saying, with the wording, like you reference to it as an action rather than anyway, whatever. Big effects, and they persist across electoral cycles. So I'm sure some of it will wear out, but a lot of it looks surprisingly persistent. Sorry, long answer, but long question. Yeah.
On the organ donors, why don't you just make the default that you are an organ donor unless you opt out?
Yeah. It's a good question. The Welsh, of course, are absolutely thinking about it, and some countries do that. The real reason in the UK is politics. So it's, and I mean, politics in a deep sense, the public don't want it, in England anyway. It has been rehearsed before. You know, so some countries have gone that route. There is actually another reason why there's something to be said for a so-called active choice or a prompted choice, which is one of the problems is if you do have a so-called presumed consent, even though you get these big numbers about a number of people on the register, or potential donors, actually what really also matters is what happens when the person's actually died and is in hospital, and what does everyone do? And quite often, the relatives make a different decision. And one of the arguments is if you've made an active choice, it is much more likely to be respected. So it's not just the number of people on the register, it's whether it's followed through. And there is evidence that, I mean, from Illinois in particular, using a prompted choice method, able to get 70% of people on the register. So it's not perfect, but that's pretty good going. Yeah.
Did you?
Okay.
I just wanted to prompt you to talk a little bit more about how nudge has been used for growth. It sounded like you might have some interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's really interesting actually, because obviously there's some areas like my colleagues at the Treasury are like, fine, you can go and play over there and do this and that and the other. It's like, but growth, like, you know, that's serious, really for proper economists. But actually, of course, it's subject to all the same kinds of issues. You have to break it down often to specific behaviours. I mean, the most obvious one is Keynes' stuff about animal spirits, right? So what we often find in many domains is that people's estimate of other people, we know they're influenced by other people's behaviour. Of course, that is rational, actually, in an economy anyway. But their estimates are wrong, are very often wrong, about what other people are doing. And they're systematically wrong. So that is an interesting clue, particularly if you think about confidence, say. So take another domain. If you say to people, if you drop wallets, this is a real study, right? So called lost wallet or lost envelope studies on a variant, you drop a load of wallets across a city and you say to people, how many wallets do you think will be returned? Right? So you put a bit of money in them and a couple of pictures with an address. And what do you think? For London, how many wallets do you think get returned? 70%. Oh, you're very good. It is 70%. See, Keenies, I primed you. Anyway, but it's very impressive. Most people say about 20%, right? That's a typical estimate, but it is about 70%. But the point that you get your estimate wrong is really consequential, right? So similarly, you're trying to make a decision about, well, shall I take on an extra person for my firm, or shall I do this or that? If your estimates are wrong, right, then you make a different decision. So an example would be trying to give local feedback. We're doing some work where you give more precise feedback to local business about what's going on in their economy, right, in order that they might calibrate more accurately and you get less of these overswing. Other issues are, you might look in, if you think about one of the big problems has been in the liquidity, sort of in lending, right? So we've got these kind of interesting situations where a lot of firms say, and SMEs particularly say they can't get money. And of course, partly it's like you want to just get more money going through the system. But you get these interesting puzzles, you get build up of massive amount of cash held by some of the big firms, right? On the one hand, but SMEs aren't getting money. So we think about, well, what else could you do? And one of the things, again, we're really interested in kind of frictional details and so on. So we did some interventions around, instead of just giving more money through the various lending schemes to banks, is to try and persuade companies that aren't banks, but could de facto be banks, right? So you're a small builder, you don't really like going into bank, they don't really like you think, and so on and so on. But every week you're going into a lumber yard, right? And you're buying tools and so on. So why doesn't B&Q lend you money instead, right? They could do it. They've got your credit information and so on and so on. So it's basically persuading some companies like that to say, why don't you move into the lending market and we will arrange some schemes which were designed for banks for you to use them instead. And hey presto, they're really effective. There are things about credit, micro things like credit. So a lot of people's credit ratings are crap, but they just need to do certain simple things. Like if you're not on the electoral register, it pulls down your credit rating, right? So, well, can you prompt people to do that? Or one of the things that drives the Prime Minister mad, right, is that there are all these government schemes to give money to businesses that often have low take-up. Right? It's like, well, why don't you do it? What can you do? How can you communicate to government businesses, from government to businesses? Government writes to businesses all the bloody time, right? The number of customer communications that HMRC, the Revenue Service, has with British citizens in various forms in a year is 619 million, which is a lot if you think about how many people there are. So you think, well, why don't you, instead of just telling people, when you, for example, you register for VAT, why don't you tell them something about, or give them a prompt for, why don't you take on an extra employee, and there's an easy way of doing it, click through or whatever. So HMRC were obsessed about, we couldn't do this because statutory bar, we only use our stuff for tax. And anyway, it would mean that it would detract from our core business and blah, blah, blah. So we were sure that if we used additional prompts on growth, it would increase the number of uptake that they took on the tax information. Sorry, this is a bit boring in detail, but actually, it turns out we're able to show them, we do an intervention, we do a trial, and we show by adding prompts to businesses on this stuff, and when you without taking on an extra employee. Not only is it lots of click-through to that kind of information scheme, but it increases the click-through to tax, right? Or, look, I'll give you one last example. We're doing growth vouchers, stuff on growth vouchers. We give businesses, you apply for this thing and you get a chunk of money which you can use particularly for business advice. One of the reasons why we're doing this is we think, you don't have to be a behavioural economist to decide it's important, I suppose, but one of the reasons why businesses don't take advice is because they have no idea if that advice is any good, actually. It's like, yeah. How would you know if you're a business that someone's going to give you good advice? There's no TripAdvisor equivalent. So actually the real reason for these growth vouchers is that they have a condition and you get this extra money, you just have to give feedback on whether the advice you got was any bloody good. So we're trying to pump prime a market failure in that case, which has got a particular issue about advice markets and whatever. So some of these you get through a classic method, but actually what I'm just trying to say is there are lots of issues you can look at where these kind of little failures and you can break them down to more specific behaviour and then actually we can refashion to get impacts on growth, which the biggest would be business confidence. So.
Yeah.
I was thinking particularly about your example of pensions uptake. And I was thinking, really, when sort of does a nudge become a push? I mean, do you think it's legitimate to make it harder to opt out if that then leads to increased outcomes that you sort of find desirable? And really, yeah, really where you draw the line between what's sort of legitimate for government to do and what's not?
Right, it's a really good question.
It's actually a fundamental one. So, I mean, it partly bears on the organ donation issues. Like, what do people really think? What do you think is right? Actually, it's quite easy to think of lots of things which would be nudges, particularly defaults, which would seem to be easy and efficient. But is it the right thing to do? So Cass, actually, who's my opposite number, who wrote Nudge in Washington for a while, he is the example of, wouldn't life be a lot easier if we just said, we'll assume your vote is the same as you did last time unless you say otherwise. Right? It's like, oh yeah, that'd be pretty neat. But like, is that the right thing to do? Right, or is it not? One of the reasons why I think the pension default was able to stick and happened was that Adair Turner did a very big consultation exercise where basically the public, shown so sort of early results, said, oh, why don't you change the default? They kind of, actually what happened is they gave government permission to change the default. So I think a lot of this stuff is sort of, it can be at the individual level, also a kind of national collective level. It's kind of commitment devices, right? Is that we know that we're subject to certain kind of issues and so we tie ourselves into it in some way. Like actually in financial products, people will choose often a bank account which has got the same interest rate but that they can't take the money from a year, right? So they're voluntarily binding themselves in. So actually to do this stuff on a serious scale, you actually have to hitch it, I think, even more aggressively than we've done now, to stronger mechanisms where the public give government permission and they say, actually, you do the trial, blah, 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 and then you say, well, what do you think? Right? What would be the right thing to do? Otherwise, who am I to say any better than anyone else what the default should be? I mean, in some cases, it's relatively easy, like, well, if you don't pay your tax, it's a bit of a bummer on all those people who do, There are plenty of areas which are much greater than that.
Excuse me, this is the California system, isn't it, where people vote on a single issue initially?
Well, you could go for, or a Swiss model of democracy. I mean, I think it's a very interesting area. Yeah.
Yeah. So I come from Belgium, which is very much influenced by French culture. And so there, the question that the gentleman before just asked is completely the opposite. It's like, in Belgium, it's just obvious that you go for a pension. There's no question, should you go for a pension or should you not go for a pension? It's obvious that it's good for you, and so the government imposes it on you. And we have much less of this kind of individual freedom obsession, let's say. And so,
Anglo-Saxon hang on.
Yeah. And so, yeah, the question is for example, with pensions, what kind of, do you think it's a cultural thing that kind of you can't say everybody should just pay pension, get a pension because obviously it will be better for you to have a pension, or and the same might be actually for the utilities, right? People don't want to choose. Why don't we nationalize utility? It will be cheaper. But also there is maybe this obsession of competition being great. So I don't know. Maybe you can comment on that.
So I'm just trying to get my head around. I got a Cambridge economist trying to tell me that maybe competition's not so great. Look, there clearly are cultural differences, and on pensions you see it writ large, right? And so the baseline is different about public acceptability in different places. I mean, that's true, and that just underwrites the reason why you have to do. I mean, not only when we do trials, we're not only doing them actually to test efficacy. In some ways, we're also, and we publish results as we go along. We're saying to people, is this acceptable? This is the right way of doing it, or is it not? You know, like, I don't know, to go back to voting, we ran a trial for voter registration, actually, using a lottery to encourage people to register to vote. It's actually pretty effective, but it wasn't clear that ministers really wanted to use it, actually, in the UK. So, and in fact, in lotteries in general, lotteries are really, if you think about it in terms of incentive, you've got 50 million to drop on something, like to encourage it, right? And you could spread it normally rationally through some little teeny incentive. Well, why would you do? Why don't you put it into a lottery, like on Green Deal, right? Which hasn't had a lot of people take it up, but lots of subsidies. Or why don't you say, hey, you know, 1 in 1,000 people will pay off your mortgage, right? For the same amount of money, behaviourally might be much, much more effective. But there are also questions about, is that okay, right? And there'll be both public and private. So anyway, look, those conversations will kind of run and run. There is one other interesting cross-national difference, actually, which we've seen, which I hadn't really tuned into before. So, I mean, you'll gather we're doing lots of these controlled trials, right? Intervention studies, basically. We get a lot of approaches from other governments now from across the world who want to do these things. One of the big issues is many governments don't think they can do a controlled trial. They think a controlled trial is unacceptable. And it's kind of, that is itself kind of cultural, like as a reference about the method itself. So if you're in Germany, say, they are really not into doing trials and experiments on people. It's kind of quite rooted in their constitution these days. But it's kind of a real major block, actually. So, yeah.
Okay, so obviously there's been a lot of talk recently about reforming economics towards the universities, and one of the main points is that economics does lack this detachment from the real world. Now, I just wondered what your thoughts were on behavioural sciences advancing, say, look at it, 20 years' time. Is it possible that the work that you're doing right now has potential to discredit the economics that we're being taught at university today, or is it possible that they can work in a complementary fashion to the existing economic theory?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of us think it clearly can be complementary. I mean, look, I recruit people who are smart economists like you guys, and even though obviously what you've been taught has sort of rotted your brains a bit, you've still got good brains and good analytic methods which we can use, right? You know, you're interested in being able to calculate certain kind of elasticities or do random discontinuity designs or whatever. So there are certainly some skills that you're learning along the way. It does seem a little peculiar that, you know, people like David Halpern or whatever, you know David Halpern, you had him? Anyway, Professor of Economics at Harvard, he's a fantastic guy. They're really interesting on this kind of stuff. Right, so people at that level are doing lots of this, you know, and Richard in Chicago and blah, blah, blah. Not so many in the UK, but in the US particularly, like top-level economists are doing a lot of this stuff, and it's very exciting and interesting. And they're still teaching all this kind of crap in undergraduate level. I'm sorry, it's too rude about it, but it does seem like, you know, wouldn't you want to inject a little bit of reality, and it makes the models more complicated. But you know what? Hey, presto, the world turns out to be a lot more complicated than your models. I mean, I assume it's inevitable, and that, you know, at Harvard now, the courses that are offered, Harvard's getting pretty good at this, the behavioural economics lectures, you know, are just packed, and they have to run them twice, and so on and so on. I mean, I think it is obviously compatible, but it's also working out, like, as actually Halpern does, a very good example, like when do you get the failures and when do you not? Why is it that you can, you know, like in his example, you know, people will choose a terrible bank account, you know, or financial product for a lifetime on the back of they were given a toaster or even a crappy little checkbook when they were students. But the market doesn't then do the same thing. Like you can't buy a $10,000 Apple, even if you were prone to do so. You know, so why does it break down? Where does it break down, and what you do about it? So it is a very kind of exciting area. I mean, there is definitely also unfinished business. It relates to the earlier question, really, which is that this stuff is quite atheoretical, a lot of it, certainly stuff that we do. We just want it to be quite pragmatic. And there's some very interesting work to be done to systematise some of it. But you're still going to have to get your head around the fact that people and societies and social influence is quite complicated and messy. But, you know, it's cool. It is a really exciting area. And it's a policy maker. I mean, I spent a long time doing strategic policy, and you make these big sweeping changes and whatever. It's amazingly satisfying to make an intervention and be able to see the sort of causal line of sight between the change you've made, a little bit of theory it was based on, and the impact on the world, right? Imagine you can do that in every area of, you know, policy, to make everything like 15, 20, 30%, but sometimes the effects are enormous, at almost no marginal cost, left, right and centre. I mean, that's your austerity problem dealt with, right? If you just do this stuff properly. So I'm pretty excited about it, and in some areas it is obviously a game changer. I mean, more than half of years of healthy life lost are to behavioural factors. A lot more if you account for social support, like how people help and support each other. Is that where we spend our money? Obviously not. I mean, a healthcare system, you know, formal healthcare system, you've got less than 5% on public health. Research, we spend billions on research in health, right? Literally billions and millions. You know what proportion of it is on behavioural factors? Those behavioural factors explain more than half a year's healthy life lost. Less than 0.5%. And of that 0.5%, the majority is spent on medical compliance. Why don't people take their pills, right? Because it's driven by pharma, you know? So you just think, okay, just using a bit of this stuff, like Kevin Volt's stuff on incentives around weight loss or whatever, it's like, it's just, you know, the effects are enormous, right? And one other thing, by the way, it's often said, is that even though psychologists dug a lot of this stuff up, then economists are interested in effect sizes, it's often said, right? And so that's a really powerful combination, right? To take that, right, to use this stuff and then use it on that kind of scale. And also, of course, economics is the language of policy, as a reality too.
I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to a close now, but obviously on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of the site, thank you.